For 50 years, the United States government maintained one of the most significant cover-ups of the Cold War. American fighter pilots in Korea knew the truth. They had fought Soviet pilots in the skies over North Korea. They had engaged in dogfights with MiG-15 fighters flown by experienced Soviet Air Force pilots. They had shot down Soviet aircraft and had been shot down by Soviet pilots. But officially, according to the US government, none of this happened. Officially, the Soviet Union was not involved in the Korean War as a combatant. The MiG-15s that American pilots faced were supposedly flown by North Korean and Chinese pilots. This was a lie, and everyone involved knew it was a lie, but it was a necessary lie to prevent the Korean War from escalating into World War III. This is the story of the secret air war over Korea, where American and Soviet pilots fought and died in combat, while their governments pretended it was not happening, and how the truth remained buried for half a century. The Korean War began in June 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, intervened to defend South Korea. American air power quickly established dominance over the battlefield. The North Korean Air Force was small and poorly equipped. American fighters, primarily the F-80 Shooting Star and the older propeller-driven F-51 Mustang, controlled the skies. American bombers ranged freely over North Korea, destroying bridges, railroads, supply depots, and any military target they could find. The war seemed to be going well from an air power perspective. Then came November 1950, and everything changed. As American and UN forces pushed north toward the Chinese border, the Chinese entered the war with massive ground forces. But the Chinese brought something else as well. They brought the MiG-15, a swept-wing jet fighter that was faster, more maneuverable, and more heavily armed than anything the Americans had in theater. The MiG-15 was a game changer. It could fly higher and faster than the F-80. It could outclimb American fighters. Its cannons were devastating. Suddenly, American air superiority was challenged. The first encounter came on November 1, 1950. An F-51 Mustang pilot reported being attacked by a jet fighter that he identified as a MiG-15. This was shocking. Where had the MiG-15s come from? Intelligence knew that the Soviet Union had supplied MiG-15s to China and North Korea, but they had not expected to see them in combat so soon or in such numbers. Over the next few weeks, more and more MiG-15s appeared. They operated from airfields in Manchuria, across the Yalu River in China, where American aircraft were forbidden to attack. They would fly south into North Korea, engage American aircraft, and then retreat back across the border to safety. The area where the MiG-15s operated became known as MiG Alley. This was a section of North Korean airspace near the Chinese border, particularly around the Yalu River. MiG Alley became the most dangerous airspace in the world for American pilots. Flights through this area meant the near certainty of encountering MiG-15s, and the MiG-15 was a formidable opponent. It was faster than the F-80 and F that made up the bulk of American fighter strength in late 1950. Only the new F-86 Sabre, which began arriving in Korea in December 1950, could match the MiG-15 in performance. American pilots quickly noticed something strange about the MiG-15s they were facing. The tactics were sophisticated. The pilots were skilled. The radio communications, when intercepted, were sometimes in Russian. This was not the performance of hastily trained Chinese or North Korean pilots. These were experienced combat pilots who knew what they were doing. American pilots began to suspect, and then to know, that they were fighting Soviet pilots. The Soviet involvement in Korea was extensive but carefully hidden. Stalin had decided to support North Korea's invasion, providing weapons, equipment, and advisors. When China entered the war, Stalin agreed to provide air support, but Stalin was careful. He did not want a direct confrontation with the United States that might lead to World War III, so Soviet involvement was secret. Soviet pilots flew combat missions in MiG-15s that bore Chinese or North Korean markings. They wore Chinese uniforms. They were ordered to speak only Korean or Chinese on the radio, though in the heat of combat, many reverted to Russian. They operated from bases in China, technically not on North Korean territory. If shot down over Korea, they were to destroy any evidence of their nationality. If captured, they were to claim to be Chinese or North Korean. The Soviet units that fought in Korea were among the best in the Soviet Air Force. The 64th Fighter Aviation Corps was specifically formed for service in Korea. It eventually included multiple air divisions and hundreds of pilots. These were not inexperienced rookies. Many were veterans of World War II, men who had flown hundreds of combat missions against the Luftwaffe. They were fighter aces with multiple kills. They knew air combat, knew how to fight and survive. When American pilots faced these men in the skies over Korea, they were facing some of the best pilots in the world. The arrival of the F-86 Sabre in Korea changed the balance. The Sabre was America's answer to the MiG-15. It was a swept-wing jet fighter. Similar in appearance and performance to the MiG, the Sabre was slightly less capable than the MiG-15 in some respects. It could not climb as fast, could not fly quite as high. But the Sabre had better control at high speeds, better visibility from the cockpit, and importantly, better gun sight technology. The Americans had developed a radar-ranging gun sight that calculated distance and lead automatically, making accurate shooting much easier. The MiG-15 had a simpler sight that required more pilot skill to use effectively. The Sabres were flown by highly trained American pilots, many of them World War II veterans. The 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing was the first Sabre unit in Korea, arriving in December 1950. These pilots were eager to test themselves against the MiG-15. They knew they were facing a formidable opponent, and they relished the challenge. The stage was set for one of the great aerial campaigns in history, a sustained air battle between American F-86 pilots and Soviet MiG-15 pilots, fought in the skies over North Korea for nearly 3 years. The dogfights in MiG Alley were intense and deadly. A typical engagement would unfold like this. American Sabres, flying in flights of 4 aircraft, would sweep north toward the Yalu River. They flew at high altitude, around 30,000 to 40,000 feet, the edge of the Sabre's performance envelope. They watched for MiGs, which often waited at even higher altitude, up near 50,000 feet, where the MiG-15's superior climb rate gave them an advantage. The MiGs would dive on the Sabres, attacking from above with the advantage of speed and position. The Sabres would react, turning to meet the attack, and a swirling dogfight would develop. These fights were violent and chaotic. Aircraft would be pulling high-G maneuvers, turning as tight as possible, trying to get on an opponent's tail while preventing an opponent from getting on theirs. The speeds were incredible, jets traveling at 500 to 600 miles per hour, sometimes faster in a dive. At these speeds, things happened very fast. A pilot might have only seconds to identify a target, line up a shot, and fire before the tactical situation changed. Ammunition was limited, maybe 15 to 20 seconds of firing time, so every shot had to count. The Sabre pilots developed tactics to counter the MiG's advantages. They learned to fight in the vertical, using maneuvers that traded altitude for speed and vice versa. They learned to work in pairs, with a leader and a wingman, the wingman protecting the leader while the leader made the attacks. They learned to use the Sabre's better high-speed handling, pushing the aircraft to speeds where the MiG-15 became difficult to control. And they learned to be aggressive, to press attacks even when outnumbered, because the MiG pilots, despite their skill, often seemed hesitant to engage in protracted dogfights. The Soviet pilots also developed effective tactics. They used their altitude advantage to set up attacks. They would dive on American formations, make slashing attacks with their powerful cannons, and then zoom back up to altitude where the Sabres could not follow. They avoided dogfights when possible, preferring to use hit-and-run tactics that played to the MiG-15's strengths. When they did engage in turning fights, they were formidable opponents. Soviet records show that their pilots were under strict orders to avoid unnecessary risks, to be careful about fuel management, and to return to base if the tactical situation was unfavorable. This was partly because losing experienced pilots was costly, and partly because a pilot shot down over North Korea faced the risk of capture and the exposure of Soviet involvement. American pilots quickly learned that not all MiGs were flown by equally skilled pilots. The really dangerous ones, the ones with excellent tactics and aggressive flying, were almost certainly Soviet. The less capable ones, the ones that seemed hesitant or made basic mistakes, were probably Chinese or North Korean. The Chinese began training their own pilots and sending them into combat in 1951 and 1952. These pilots were brave but inexperienced. They had received minimal training, often just a few months, before being sent into combat against veteran American pilots. The results were predictable. Chinese pilots died in large numbers. The Soviets, meanwhile, continued to provide a core of skilled pilots who kept the MiG threat viable. The actual shooting down of Soviet aircraft by American pilots happened regularly throughout the war. American pilots would get behind a MiG, would fire their machine guns, would see hits, would see the MiG start to trail smoke or fire, would watch it go down. Sometimes the pilot would eject and parachute to the ground. Sometimes the aircraft would crash. Each victory was recorded, debriefed, and confirmed. The pilots knew they had shot down a MiG, but the official records were ambiguous about who was flying those MiGs. One of the problems with confirming kills was that most of the fighting happened over North Korean territory. American pilots could not go down to examine wreckage or capture pilots to confirm nationality. The evidence was circumstantial. Radio intercepts in Russian, tactical behavior consistent with Soviet training, occasional captured documents, defectors who told stories of Soviet involvement, but there was no definitive proof that the U.S. government could or would acknowledge publicly. The U.S. government's position was clear and was communicated to the pilots. You are not fighting Soviet pilots. The Soviet Union is not a combatant in this war. Any claims that Soviet pilots are flying in Korea are communist propaganda designed to create conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was the official line, and it had to be maintained. Why? Because acknowledging that American and Soviet forces were in direct combat would escalate the war dangerously. It would give hardliners in both the United States and the Soviet Union ammunition to demand more aggressive action. It might lead to attacks on Soviet territory, to Soviet attacks on American forces elsewhere, to a spiral that could end in World War III. Both the United States and the Soviet Union understood this. Both governments cooperated in maintaining the fiction that no direct combat was occurring. When Soviet pilots were shot down and killed, their bodies were quietly recovered by Soviet or Chinese forces. When Soviet pilots were captured, they claimed to be Chinese or Korean, and the Americans, after debriefing them and knowing full well they were lying, would turn them over to the Chinese or North Koreans in prisoner exchanges. The official records would show them as Chinese or North Korean casualties, not Soviet. American pilots found this frustrating. They knew who they were fighting. They knew they were up against some of the best pilots in the world. They wanted credit for their victories over Soviet opponents. They wanted the American public to understand what they were facing, but they were told to keep quiet. The classification of Soviet involvement was at the highest levels. Pilots could talk among themselves, could write letters home that were carefully vague, but they could not publicly state that they were fighting Soviets. This remained classified information for decades. The air war over Korea produced some of the great fighter aces of the jet age. Captain Joseph McConnell became the top American ace of the war with 16 confirmed kills. Major James Jabara was the first American jet ace, achieving 5 kills in May 1951. Colonel Francis Gabreski, a World War II ace with 28 kills against the Germans, added 6.5 more in Korea. These men and dozens of others became legends in the fighter-pilot community. They had fought in MiG Alley, had survived hundreds of missions, had shot down multiple enemy aircraft. But the official records did not specify that many of their kills were against Soviet pilots. Soviet records, which were kept secret for even longer than American records, tell the other side of the story. Soviet pilots also achieved ace status in Korea. The Soviets had their own heroes. Yevgeny Pepeliev was credited with 19 kills, though American records do not confirm all of these. Nikolai Sutyagin was credited with 21 kills in Soviet records. These men were decorated as heroes of the Soviet Union, but their service in Korea was secret. Their families were told they were on training missions in China. If they were killed, their deaths were attributed to training accidents or other causes. The Soviet government maintained the fiction that no Soviet pilots had died in Korea. The actual combat was more complicated than a simple tally of victories suggests. Both sides claimed more kills than the other side acknowledged losing. This is common in air warfare. In the confusion of a dogfight, multiple pilots might fire at the same aircraft and each claim a kill. An aircraft might be seen trailing smoke and diving, but might actually recover and return to base. An aircraft might be claimed as destroyed, but only damaged. The Americans claimed a kill ratio of about 10-1 over the MiGs, meaning for every Sabre lost in air combat, 10 MiGs were shot down. Soviet records dispute this, claiming their losses were much lower and their kill claims against Sabres were much higher. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The Americans certainly had an advantage. They had better trained pilots, better tactics, better technology in some respects. But the Soviets were not pushovers. They shot down Sabres and killed American pilots. The air war was intense and costly for both sides. What is clear is that American and Soviet pilots fought each other directly, engaged in dogfights at 40,000 feet over North Korea, shot at each other with cannons and machine guns, and killed each other. This was direct combat between American and Soviet military forces, the only sustained direct combat of the entire Cold War, and it was kept secret. The secrecy extended to every aspect of the Soviet operation. Soviet pilots who rotated into Korea traveled in civilian clothes on commercial flights to China. At Chinese bases, they changed into Chinese uniforms and were briefed on their cover stories. They were given false names and false identities. If asked, they were Chinese or North Korean volunteers. Their Soviet identity papers were taken from them and secured. They were told that if shot down, they were to destroy anything that might identify them as Soviet. Maps, documents, personal items, all had to be destroyed or ditched before ejecting or crash landing. The Soviet pilots operated under significant restrictions. They were not allowed to fly over the ocean or over South Korean territory. This was to minimize the risk of a pilot being shot down and captured by American or South Korean forces where their identity might be exposed. They were not allowed to pursue American aircraft south of a certain line. They operated primarily over the northwestern corner of North Korea and sometimes over Chinese territory. This gave American pilots a sanctuary to the south. If a Sabre pilot was damaged and could not continue fighting, he could dive south knowing that MiGs would not follow beyond a certain point. The restrictions frustrated Soviet pilots who felt they could have been more effective if allowed to operate freely. But Stalin and later Soviet leadership were adamant. The fiction of non-involvement had to be maintained. Soviet pilots could fight and die in Korea, but the Soviet Union could not officially acknowledge it. This policy continued even after Stalin's death in March 1953. The new Soviet leadership under Khrushchev continued the policy of secrecy. American intelligence knew about Soviet involvement from early in the war. Signals intelligence intercepted Russian-language radio communications. Photo reconnaissance showed Soviet markings on aircraft before they were painted over with Chinese or North Korean markings. Defectors provided information. Korean War POWs who had been in North Korea reported seeing European-looking pilots. The intelligence community had extensive evidence of Soviet involvement. But this intelligence was classified at the highest levels. It was briefed to the president and senior officials, but was not made public. Why did the US government maintain the fiction? There were several reasons. First, acknowledging Soviet involvement would create enormous pressure to expand the war. If American forces were fighting Soviets in Korea, why not attack Soviet bases in Siberia or China? Why not blockade Soviet ports? Why not use nuclear weapons against Soviet targets? The logic of war would demand escalation. But escalation meant the risk of World War III, nuclear war, the destruction of civilization. Truman and later Eisenhower were determined to keep the Korean War limited. Second, acknowledging Soviet involvement would complicate relations with allies. European NATO allies were already nervous about the Korean War. They feared it would drain American resources and attention from the defense of Europe. If the war escalated into a direct US-Soviet conflict, Europe might become a battlefield. European governments pleaded with Washington to keep the war limited. Publicly confirming Soviet involvement would make that harder. Third, there was the question of what acknowledging Soviet involvement would accomplish. If the US government said publicly that Soviet pilots were flying in Korea, what would change? The Soviets would deny it. Without physical proof, captured pilots or crashed aircraft with clear Soviet identification, the claim would be disputed. It would become a propaganda battle with uncertain outcome. Better to keep it classified, to deal with it through intelligence channels and quiet diplomacy. Fourth, there were operational security reasons. If the US publicized what it knew about Soviet operations, it would reveal sources and methods. The Soviets would know that their communications were being intercepted, that their security had been compromised. They would change their procedures, making future intelligence collection more difficult, keeping the knowledge classified protected intelligence capabilities. So the cover-up was maintained. American pilots were told to be vague in their reports and public statements. Intelligence reports about Soviet involvement were classified top secret. The media, when they asked questions, were given bland official statements. No, we have no evidence of Soviet pilots in Korea. The MiGs are flown by Chinese and North Korean pilots. Yes, some of them are quite skilled, probably trained by Soviets, but there is no evidence of direct Soviet involvement. Some information did leak out. Reporters who talked to pilots off the record heard stories about Russian on the radio, about tactics that seemed too sophisticated for newly trained Chinese pilots. Some journalists wrote articles suggesting Soviet involvement, but without official confirmation, these remained allegations. The government denied them, and the story never gained mainstream acceptance. The pilots themselves were generally loyal to the classification requirements. They understood the larger strategic picture. They knew that acknowledging Soviet involvement could escalate the war, could lead to their friends and fellow pilots being sent on even more dangerous missions, could lead to World War III. So they kept quiet, at least publicly. In bars and officers' clubs, among themselves, they talked freely. They knew who they had been fighting. But in official debriefings, in interviews with reporters, in letters home, they were careful. The Korean War ended in July 1953 with an armistice. The air war over MiG-Ali ended. Soviet pilots rotated out of China and returned to the Soviet Union. They were told, once again, that their service in Korea was secret, that they were not to discuss it, that officially they had been on training missions. They received medals and promotions, but in closed ceremonies, not public celebrations. Their role in the war remained classified in the Soviet Union, just as it remained classified in the United States. Over the following decades, the secret was maintained. During the Cold War, neither side had any interest in revealing the truth. The United States did not want to reopen questions about the Korean War or to provide propaganda material to the Soviets. The Soviet Union did not want to admit that its pilots had been involved in a war where they had taken significant casualties and had not achieved their objectives. So both governments kept the records classified. American pilots who had fought in Korea grew older. They retired from the military. Some wrote memoirs, but they were careful to comply with classification restrictions. They could write about flying the F-86, about combat with MiGs, about the tactics and techniques, but they could not explicitly state that they had fought Soviet pilots. The most they could do was hint, suggest, imply. Readers who knew what to look for could read between the lines, but the explicit truth remained classified. In the 1980s and 1990s, as the Cold War wound down and eventually ended, pressure began to build for declassification. Historians wanted access to records. Veterans wanted to tell their full stories. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 opened up new possibilities. Soviet records began to be released. Russian veterans began to talk about their service in Korea. The Russian government, no longer communist and no longer needing to maintain Soviet-era lies, began to acknowledge what had happened. In the mid-1990s, Russian and American veterans began to meet. There were conferences where former enemies sat down together, former Sabre pilots and former MiG pilots, now old men, sharing stories and memories. These meetings were emotional and revealing. The Americans finally had confirmation of what they had always known. Yes, they had been fighting Soviets. The Russian veterans acknowledged it. They talked about the combat, about specific battles, about mutual respect for each other's skills. Friendships formed between men who had once tried to kill each other. The US government began to declassify records in the 1990s and 2000s. Intelligence reports from the Korean War that mentioned Soviet involvement were released. Mission reports that had been sanitized to remove references to Soviet pilots were released in full. Official histories were updated. The Air Force acknowledged what had been secret for decades. Yes, American pilots in Korea had fought Soviet pilots. The MiGs in MiG Alley had often been flown by Soviet Air Force pilots. This was no longer classified. The declassification allowed a fuller understanding of the air war in Korea. Historians could now write complete accounts of what had happened. The bravery and skill of American pilots could be fully appreciated. They had not just been fighting hastily trained Chinese pilots. They had been fighting some of the best pilots in the world, Soviet veterans of World War II, and they had held their own and ultimately prevailed. The kill ratios, while disputed, showed American success. Even if the actual ratio was not 10-1, but something like 3 or 4-1, it still represented a significant American advantage. The reasons for American success were multiple. American pilots were better trained, spending far more time in training before being sent to combat. American tactics were better, emphasizing teamwork and mutual support. American technology was better in some respects, particularly the radar gun sight in the F-86. American logistics were better, ensuring that aircraft were maintained and available for missions. And American pilots were fighting over enemy territory, which meant they could take more risks, knowing that if shot down they might be rescued, while Soviet pilots over North Korea faced capture if they went down. But Soviet pilots also had advantages. The MiG-15 was a slightly better aircraft in some ways. Soviet pilots operated from bases in China where they were safe from attack. They chose when to engage and when to retreat. They had early warning from radar sites in China, and they had the advantage of experience. Many Soviet pilots in Korea were veterans with hundreds of combat missions. They knew how to survive. The fact that the air war was kept secret for so long had consequences. It distorted the historical record. For decades, the Korean War air campaign was written about as if it were primarily a struggle against Chinese and North Korean pilots. The skill and experience of the Soviet pilots was not acknowledged. The true nature of the air war, as a direct test of American and Soviet pilots and technology, was not understood. History books written during the Cold War had to dance around the truth, hinting at Soviet involvement but not stating it explicitly. The secrecy also affected how the military learned from the war. Lessons learned from fighting Soviet pilots could not be widely shared because the fact of Soviet involvement was classified. Tactical innovations developed to counter Soviet MiG tactics could not be fully explained without acknowledging who the opponent was. Training programs for future fighter pilots could not use the full Korean experience because much of it was classified. Once the truth was revealed, historians and analysts could reassess. The air war in Korea could be seen as a preview of Cold War air combat, a test of American and Soviet capabilities, a proving ground for tactics and technology that would shape air combat for decades. The F-86 versus MiG-15 battles informed the development of next-generation fighters. The tactics developed in MiG-Ali influenced training programs. The lessons learned about air combat at high speeds and high altitudes shaped doctrine. The revelation of Soviet involvement also put the Korean War in a new light. It was not just a regional conflict, a civil war between North and South Korea with outside involvement. It was a direct military confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers, testing each other's strength and resolve. The fact that both governments worked to keep it limited, to prevent escalation, showed a level of sophistication and restraint that probably prevented World War III. Both sides understood the stakes. Both sides fought hard, but within limits. Both sides kept the conflict from spiraling out of control. The individual stories of American pilots who fought Soviet MiG pilots in Korea are stories of courage and skill. These men flew missions knowing they might not come back. They flew against an enemy that was skilled and dangerous. They fought in some of the most advanced aircraft of their time, pushing the limits of speed and altitude, engaging in combat that was as dangerous as anything in World War II, but faster and more technically demanding. They won more often than they lost, but they paid a price. American pilots died in MiG-Ali. Sabres were shot down, men were killed or captured. The victory in the air war was real but costly. The individual stories of Soviet pilots are equally compelling. These men volunteered for or were assigned to a secret mission in a foreign country. They flew under false identities, knowing that if they were captured or killed, their families might never know the truth. They fought against Americans who were flying aircraft just as capable as their own, who were just as skilled, who were just as determined. Soviet pilots died in Korea. Their families were told they died in training accidents. Their graves sometimes did not even list the real cause of death. They were heroes who could not be publicly acknowledged as such. One particularly interesting aspect of the secret air war was the intelligence game. Both sides were trying to learn about the other's aircraft and capabilities. The United States desperately wanted to examine a MiG-15. In 1953, the US offered a reward to any pilot who would defect with a MiG-15. A North Korean pilot, No Kum-sok, did exactly that, flying his MiG to a South Korean airbase in September 1953 after the armistice. The US got its hands on a MiG-15, examined it thoroughly, flew it, and learned its strengths and weaknesses. This intelligence was invaluable. The Soviets were similarly interested in American aircraft. When an F-86 was shot down and crashed in relatively intact condition, Soviet and Chinese forces would rush to secure the wreckage. They wanted to examine the radar gun sight, the engine, the control systems. Some of this technology found its way back to the Soviet Union and influenced their own aircraft development. The air war in Korea was not just about shooting down enemy aircraft. It was about learning, about gaining technological intelligence, about understanding the enemy's capabilities. The electronic warfare aspect was also significant. Both sides used radar, both to direct their fighters and to provide early warning of enemy attacks. Both sides tried to jam or deceive enemy radar. The Americans had better radar technology, but the Soviets and Chinese had more radar sites covering the border area. The constant electronic duel was part of the air war, though it received less attention than the dogfights. The psychological aspect of the secret war was complex. American pilots knew they were fighting Soviets but could not say so publicly. This created a strange cognitive dissonance. They were fighting an enemy that officially did not exist. When they shot down a MiG and believed the pilot was Soviet, there was a sense of satisfaction of having bested the main enemy of the Cold War. But there was also frustration at not being able to claim credit publicly, at having to maintain the fiction. For Soviet pilots, the psychology was different. They were fighting for their country but could not admit it. They were heroes but secret heroes. If they died, their sacrifice would not be publicly acknowledged. This created a different kind of pressure. They had to fight well, had to uphold Soviet honor, but had to do so in secret. The burden of secrecy was heavy. The cover-up of Soviet involvement in Korea was remarkably successful for a very long time. In an age before the internet, before widespread leaks, before the kind of whistleblowing that became common in later decades, it was possible to keep a secret like this. Both governments wanted it kept secret. Both enforced classification rigorously. Veterans complied with the classification. Reporters who suspected the truth could not prove it without official confirmation. So the secret held for 50 years. When the truth finally came out, the reaction was muted. By the 1990s and 2000s, the Korean War was long over. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union no longer existed. The revelation that American and Soviet pilots had fought each other in Korea was interesting historically but not shocking. It did not change contemporary politics or strategy. It was a historical footnote, important for understanding that period but not immediately relevant to the present. For the veterans, the declassification meant they could finally tell their full stories. They could speak openly about what they had experienced, who they had fought, what it had meant. For some, this was a relief. For others, it came too late. Many veterans of the Korean War had already died by the time the truth was fully revealed. They had carried the secret to their grave, never able to share the complete story with their families or the public. The historical lesson of the secret air war in Korea is about the nature of the Cold War. It was a conflict where the United States and Soviet Union were enemies but could not fight each other openly without risking mutual destruction. So they fought through proxies, in limited wars, with deniable operations. Korea was one such proxy war, but with a twist. The proxies were supplemented by direct involvement that both sides pretended was not happening. American and Soviet forces fought each other directly, but under a cover of official denial. This allowed the conflict to remain limited, to be controlled, to end without escalating to global war. This model was repeated in other conflicts during the Cold War, though usually with less direct involvement. In Vietnam, the Soviets and Chinese provided weapons and advisors, but generally did not fly combat missions, having learned from Korea that such direct involvement was risky. In Afghanistan in the 1980s, the Americans provided weapons and support to the Mujahideen, but did not directly fight Soviet forces. The proxy war model, with limits on direct superpower involvement, became the norm. The fact that American and Soviet pilots fought each other in Korea and both governments kept it secret for 50 years shows how the Cold War was managed. It was a conflict between two systems, two ideologies, two superpowers with nuclear weapons. Direct war was unthinkable because it would lead to nuclear holocaust. So the conflict was waged through proxies, through espionage, through propaganda, through limited wars where the superpowers backed different sides, but officially did not fight each other. The secret air war in Korea was an exception where they did fight each other directly, but the fiction of non-involvement allowed the conflict to remain limited. For the American pilots who flew F-86 Sabres in MiG Alley, the truth is now acknowledged. They fought Soviet pilots. They fought the best the Soviet Air Force had to offer. They held their own and more. They maintained American air superiority over North Korea. They protected American ground forces from air attack. They did their job under difficult and dangerous conditions. And now, finally, decades after the war, their full achievement can be recognized. They fought and defeated Soviet pilots in aerial combat, something that the US government denied for 50 years, but that is now acknowledged as historical fact. The Soviet pilots, too, can now be recognized. They served their country in a secret war. They fought bravely and skillfully. They took casualties but also inflicted them. They were part of a sophisticated operation to support North Korea and China while maintaining plausible deniability of Soviet involvement. They did what their government asked of them, even though it meant fighting in secret, even though it meant their service might never be acknowledged. Now, with Soviet archives opened and Russian veterans speaking freely, their story is part of the historical record. The secret air war over Korea was one of the most significant but least known aspects of the Cold War. For 3 years, American and Soviet pilots fought each other in the skies over North Korea. They engaged in dogfights at 40,000 feet. They shot each other down. They died. And for 50 years, the governments of both countries denied that any of it happened. The truth was kept classified, hidden from public view, maintained as a state secret. Only after the Cold War ended did the full story finally come out, allowing historians to write complete accounts and veterans to tell their full stories. The revelation did not change history. The events had happened regardless of whether they were acknowledged, but it changed our understanding of history, allowing a more complete and accurate picture of what really happened during the Korean War and the early years of the Cold War.